Well, hello, and welcome to our fourth episode of C.S. Lewis and True Myth. I want to talk to you today about the impact that C.S. Lewis had on the world, and especially in relation to true myth and his idea of that. You see, one of the ways that C.S. Lewis impacted the world in which he lived, and still after his death, the one in which we live, was and is through his apologetics. He deliberately engaged in this branch of Christian theology, which seeks to defend the reasonableness of the Christian faith. Now, one of the ways Lewis helps us in our defense of Christianity is that he came himself from nearly 20 years of atheism into the Christian faith. And he was either 33 or 34 at the time, so he knew how skeptics thought. Consequently, after his conversion, Lewis became a powerhouse of apologetics, not only of the 20th century, but even still to this day. Many Christians say that the writings of Lewis were instrumental in their coming to Christ, and others that their love for apologetics was born under the influence of those writings. Now, after his conversion, for most of the next 33 years before he died, which was about a week before his 65th birthday, Lewis engaged in apologetics, answering difficult questions that skeptics had and defending against their many attacks. Because of that, we have reams of pages that can help us in all of our understanding and presenting and defending the truth, as well as Christianity. Yet due to the primacy of myth in his own thinking, both before and after he came to faith, Lewis never got away from relating Christianity to myth. While this troubles some Christians today, and I understand that, I think that once we understand his approach, we can find help in our own defense of the faith in our times. So let's consider his approach in the remainder of this video. In April 1944, Lewis was involved in a public Q&A about Christianity. When he was asked if Christianity had borrowed from earlier, more primitive religions, Lewis answered this way: "In reality, Christianity is primarily the fulfillment of the Jewish religion, but also of the fulfillment of what was vaguely hinted in all the religions at their best. What was vaguely seen in them all comes into focus in Christianity, just as God himself comes into focus by becoming man." Now, at that same session, Lewis said again answers another question. What you get is something gradually coming into focus. First, you get scattered through the heathen religions all over the world, but still quite vague and mythical, the idea of a God who is killed and broken and then comes to life again. No one knows where he is supposed to have lived or died. He's not historical. Then you get the Old Testament. Religious ideas get a bit more focused, and it comes still more into focus as it goes on. Then, in the New Testament, the thing really happens. The dying God really appears as a historical person living in a definite place and time. And that quote, you see, Lewis, that was all Lewis. In the development of his thought, Lewis never got rid of the idea that Christianity is true myth, and seems to be explaining increasingly what he meant by that phrase. Through all of his writings, he's explaining more about it, and throughout the remainder of his life as a Christian. Now, it's important to understand, though, that by saying this, Lewis in no way considered the gospel to be fictitious or lacking in reality, because, remember, it really happened. And in 1944, in another essay called Myth Became Fact, an essay, by the way, that J.R.R. Tolkien later praised, Lewis makes his most explicit statement. He writes this: "The heart of Christianity is a myth, which is also a fact. The old myth of the dying God, without ceasing to be myth, comes down from the heaven of legend and imagination to the earth of history. It happens. at a particular date, in a particular place, followed by definable historical consequences. We pass from some God dying nobody knows when or where to a historical person crucified under Pontius Pilate. In essence, it seems Lewis is saying that the gospel does not cease to be the story told by paganism about a dying God. But it is that story that has now come to be true. It really happened. Now, 3 years later, in his 1947 book entitled Miracles, his thoughts about the relationship between paganism and myth and Christianity had matured significantly. His fullest treatment of this subject, I would say, is found in chapter 14, which is the title, The Grand Miracle. He also wrote an earlier essay with that title. But in both the essay and this chapter, Lewis explains how the vegetation cycles known throughout the world and venerated by pagans in their myths were created by God as a foreshadowing of the coming death and resurrection of His incarnate Son. You see, an important thing to understand is that ancient mythology tied a whole lot of their religion to the vegetation cycles. And this was something that was very prevalent in C.S. Lewis's day. He understood a lot of people to be talking about that very thing. And it's important for us to understand that connection as we are thinking about this subject. Now, when he gets to chapter 15, he opens it up with a footnote. And this is in that book, Miracles. He opens it up with a footnote. And he explains his understanding of myth as, quote, in general, at its best, a real, though unfocused gleam of divine truth falling on human imagination, end quote. In 1955, Lewis explains how The Everlasting Man, written by G.K. Chesterton, book I have right here. Now, this book was very influential in C.S. Lewis's thought. He said it was the best book that he'd ever read about the idea of history written from a Christian perspective. He was very impressed with it, and he recommended this book to so many people that he wrote to, letters, encouraging them, read this book. He recommended it a lot. And here's what he was saying. He says that it helped him realize the important difference between myth and the Gospels, and it helped lead him to finally trusting Christ. He explains this in his own book, Surprised by Joy. You got that right here. And Surprised by Joy, his spiritual autobiography. Now, he wrote this book about 22 to 23 years after his conversion. And in this book, he comes, in a sense, full circle. He comes back to the beginning. Now, paraphrasing Chesterton in this book, he saw paganism as what he called the childhood of religion, or the prophetic dream of religion. The awakening, however, says Lewis, did not occur until the historical Christ came. The stories of Christ were not legend. Lewis said it this way: I was by now too experienced in a literary criticism to regard the Gospels as myths. They were too artless, in his opinion, too historical, in fact. And they had not that mythical taste. I've read a lot of myth, and if you read myth and then you read the Gospels, that you are reading completely different kinds of literature. But Lewis says that these Gospels set down the matter, or the matter of the great myths, the general idea. And he continues, if ever a myth had become fact, had been incarnated, it would be just like this. Now, why did he say that? Ultimately, because of the person it depicted. And he's talking about Christ. The Word had become flesh. God had become man. For Lewis, Christianity was neither a religion nor a philosophy, but instead the summing up and actuality of them all. Now, Lewis's approach suggests that we, as Christians, don't need to be afraid of the association of Christianity with myth. So long, and here is the big qualifier, so long as it is stated clearly that here and I'm quoting Lewis, here and here only in all time, myth became fact. Fact. God's myth became focused in the historical person of Jesus Christ. Lewis was not identifying Christianity with myth. He was not identifying the two, but rather saw it as fulfilling the true longing that in all of the mythologies of the world were vague foreshadowings of God's plan to incarnate himself to save humanity through death and resurrection. This was programmed into creation. This is how Lewis saw it. It was programmed into creation by God in the annual death and rebirth of the vegetation, the very things that ancient people saw were the basis of their myths. And it was a common experience of every pagan. And this natural phenomenon is where they got their ideas for myth and how their myths largely developed. You see, it's interesting to note that Paul, when addressing the pagans at Lycaonia, they started to worship him. You remember he and Barnabas were there and he healed a man. They started to worship him there. And they were saying Barnabas is Jupiter and Paul is Mercury. These were important gods. They were responsible for fertile lands. So that's why they were saying, oh wow, these gods have come down to us. And what Paul did was very instructive. He drew their attention back to the one Creator, God who had alone blessed, quote, all nations with rain and fruitful seasons. You can read that story in Acts 14, especially verses 12 through 17. Lewis has brought us to a middle ground. He does not outright reject a relationship between Christianity and myth, but at the same time, he does not embrace the idea that Christianity is only myth or non-historical symbolism. The middle ground is that Christianity conveys a story, much like the myths, not because it was copying them, which is that's what the skeptics charge, but because it was fulfilling them. It looks vaguely like them because they were looking forward. We might say, in the words of the Apostle Paul, through a glass darkly. They were looking forward to its final fruition and clarification in the person of Jesus Christ. If you like our videos, we'd like you to subscribe to them, like them, click that bell for notifications. And we just hope that this has been a real rich experience for you. I know it is for me, for us. And we want to encourage you with it. And may God bless and keep you until we meet again.